It's 9 o'clock, this is Sky News. Welcome to our show where I interview people who have something to say about the world today and how it's changing. They'll be from politics, sport, business, entertainment, public life, or they'll be everyday people caught up in the events of our times. I'll be putting my questions to tonight's special guests. Good evening. Educational underachievement and the challenge of opening up social opportunities for young people. There are no hard priorities when it comes to governing. Back to basics in the classroom is popular among parents, but does it hold the key to opening up social mobility? The government seem to think so because they've given Katharine Birbalsingh, known as Britain's strictest headmistress, the job of improving social mobility for the poor. But are we prepared to learn her lessons? Also ahead, the US political landscape has changed dramatically from the Obama administration to the Trump era and now under President Biden. Their administrations have been shaped by a global financial crisis and then the COVID pandemic. Author Michael Lewis's critically acclaimed books tackle some of the biggest moments in American history. His work has been turned into Hollywood films and now a Netflix series created by the Obama's production company. Could his books now act as a warning for future generations? And Dame Emma Thompson has had a career spanning 40 years, most known for her roles in Sense and Sensibility, Love Actually, Harry Potter and Howard's End, to name but a few. She's now talking on her sexiest role yet, addressing the hurdles faced by older women who want a healthy sex life. Emma and her co-star Daryl McCormack talked to me about sex and why protecting the younger generations from the prevalence of the porn industry is so important. Katharine Birbalsingh is the new chair of the Social Mobility Commission. In her inaugural speech today, she said that Britain is too focused on the rags to riches dream, and people in the poorest parts of society do not need to aim for an Oxbridge education. Katharine's also known as Britain's strictest headmistress. Leading a school called the Michaela Community School in a deprived area of London, her methods are often seen to be controversial. I spoke to her a short time ago. Katharine, thanks for joining us on the show today. Today you set out your vision for Britain and social mobility, or the government's new social mobility czar. But before we get on to all of that, I wanted to talk to you about education, because for viewers that don't know you, you are branded now as the country's strictest head teacher. I don't know if you love or loathe that or just find it a bit bemusing. But let's start off talking about education. There was a documentary on ITV about you and your school. And at the start of this documentary, one of your colleagues says it's not like North Korea. But those unused to your beliefs about education might think it did look a bit like North Korea. So can you explain to the viewers why it's not?
Because the place is just filled with love, you know. The children are happy, the staff are happy, the staff love seeing the children. I see them for assembly every single day. In fact, I do 7 assemblies a week, you know, because we've got 7-year groups. There's just a real sense of purpose. We all know why we're there. We're there because we want to achieve and give the children the skills and knowledge that they need to be able to make the most of their lives and to enable social mobility for our children, because we're in the inner city with children coming from a variety of different backgrounds, and we want to give them the best chances that they can have in life, really.
And just, you know, for people that haven't seen the documentary or know about your school, I mean, it is really strict. So there's no talking in corridors. I think there's a line along the corridor.
Yeah.
If you drop your pencil, you get a detention.
Well, if you were to not bring your pen in, you would get a detention. If you're dropping your pencil, that's fine.
That's fine. but I'm trying to get across it's really, really strict, and it's unusually strict compared perhaps with other state schools. Why do you do it like that?
Yeah, well, the thing about strict is that people tend to think that must mean that you're mean. But actually, I would say that it means you love the children enough to keep your standards high for them. So the pen is a good example. You need to bring a pen into school. They're all taught to make sure that they're packing their bags the night before. They've all got the same pencil case with the same pens. So there's real consistency. And those same pens are expected for 5 years. So they have 2 black pens, a blue pen, a 2B pencil. And they know exactly what they need to be in there. So in that sense, it's relatively straightforward. But then even if they do forget it, some of the children run a little shop in the morning where they sell pens for 10p. So you can always pick up a pen in the morning if you've forgotten it.
And Katharine, what do you do with kids that can't do it or won't do it? Or do you believe that it isn't that kids can't do this?
They can.
Can't adhere to your rules, I mean.
I mean, they all manage it. The key thing is to remember that children have agency and they can choose whether or not they want to do something.
What do you do with kids? What do you do with kids with special educational needs or kids with ADHD, kids that might not be able, because of their own issues, to focus in the way that you require them to focus in class? Do you have separate rules for them, or do those children have to conform, or do they not fit into the school?
Well, we have a normal intake of inner-city children, so we have a variety of children with different issues. I would say, I mean, there are a few children you might need to slightly adapt for, but I would say that too often we allow labels to force us to lower our expectations of children. And that they could achieve a lot more if we just allowed ourselves to believe in them, despite the fact that they might struggle. So if they struggle in something, you might have to give them some support in getting there to be able to meet those standards. Some children don't require much support, and some children require more support. But the key thing is to believe that they can do it.
There has been a sense from others in the teaching community that you're kind of implicitly criticising other teachers or other schools that do it differently to you. What do you say to that, Katharine?
Well, if you can do things however much you like, as long as you're doing right by the children. I mean, what I mean is, do you go to the school and visit and think the children are well behaved, they're learning lots, have they got great GCSE results, are the children happy, are they loved? If that's the case, then brilliant. But if that's not the case, then, well, we ought to be critical of those schools, shouldn't we? I mean, shouldn't we as a society say, that's not good enough, come on, you've got to do better? Now, the thing is, there are some schools in genuine difficulty that are trying very hard to get better, and that's brilliant. But there are other schools that are ideological in their position, that don't want to change because they don't believe that children can do better.
What do you mean by that, ideological in their position?
Well, for instance, they would find our strict rules offensive. They don't like that idea. But then if it's pointed out that, but look, there's lots of chaos here in this school, perhaps it would be better if you had more rules, they don't want to do that. And I would be critical of that.
You know, you spoke at the 2010 Conservative Party conference and you became kind of an emblem, if you like, of traditional ways of teaching. I mean, some of your fellow teachers make this point about you when they're asked about you, that you're an excellent teacher, clearly, with great ideas to offer, but you have become sometimes like a weapon in a culture war in which what you've just said about different methods of teaching that other parents or teachers might like, somehow you're critical of those and that becomes a culture war. What do you think about that? Do you disagree with that, or do you not mind, or do you think it's okay?
Well, I think that we all need to have high standards for all of our children. And there are children right now in classrooms with very poor behaviour who aren't able to learn. And I'm the chair of the Social Mobility Commission. I believe very much in social mobility for all of our children. And if there are children who aren't able to be upwardly mobile because of the poor behaviour in their classrooms, then that's something I need to be critical about.
In what I've read about you and what I've seen about you in terms of your teaching, you stress the importance of adults modelling standards and behaviour for children. That's a really important value for you. Do you think the Prime Minister is a good role model for children?
No, I do not think so. I don't. I wish he could be, but he isn't. And that is a bit sad. But, you know, I can't get into the ins and outs because I don't know enough about, you know, people say, you know, well, should he be there, should he not be there? I don't know. You know, I like Boris. I don't think he's a bad guy, you know, but I don't I don't know enough about what he's got up to, but I do not think that he's a good role model for children.
What's not good about him? In what way?
Well, his personal life, for instance, that does make me sort of raise an eyebrow. His hair. When I say his hair, we've got strict rules at school. You know, the other day I saw a picture of him in the metro and I looked at his hair and I thought, oh my goodness, you know, we expect our children to have professional looking hair. And I looked at his hair and I thought, gosh, I couldn't put him up on the wall and say, let's all have haircuts like him. Now you might think, oh, that's a bit pedantic and that's a bit silly, but it isn't actually. I think for our children, it's important to look professional. And sometimes Boris looks professional, but sometimes he's not professional enough for me. Let me put it that way.
OK, so family values, because that's a small secret.
The family values, exactly. It's the sort of thing that makes me pause a little bit. Now, and that's not to say he just, you know, and actually I'd say I'm relatively liberal about these things to a certain extent, you know, but he does kind of push the boat out a bit on that.
On character?
Well, and that's where you start. And as I say, I don't know the ins and outs enough about all the recent Partygate stuff. You know, I just don't know the details because I'm too busy working to follow all of that. But it does sort of make you pause and go, You know, I certainly would never be able to put him up and say, be like him. I couldn't do that.
Look, you just did a speech on social mobility. You talked about a fresh approach. I listened to it, and at the heart of it, it seemed to me that your approach is driven through a combination of sort of spreading opportunity more across the country and an individual's own agency to kind of change their lives, rather than talking about sort of structures holding people back and structural inequality. Is that a fair interpretation of what your approach will be in this job?
Yeah. The thing is that we want to look at people who are bucking the trends. How is it that in an unequal society that some people are upwardly mobile? What do they do to achieve that? And so we want to look at them. We also want to look at the ideas around what happens to the many as opposed to the few. Often I think as a society we are pushed to look at the people who start at the bottom and then zoom to the top, and it makes a great Hollywood film. It's romantic, it's wonderful. Look, I grew up with nothing and now I'm this big CEO and I eat expensive dinners. But not all of us necessarily want to do that. And some of us want to have shorter mobilities. And it would be wrong, for instance, someone comes from a home that's where lots of unemployment and then they become a manager at Sainsbury's. Well, isn't that something to celebrate? But often we don't necessarily celebrate these smaller achievements because we only see the huge leap as the success story. And we would like to change the narrative around that, really.
Going on to that idea about the sort of success being defined as, I think you said, a sort of caretaker's daughter ending up in Oxbridge, and it actually being success defined as someone whose parents are unemployed and then have been long-term unemployed and then they get a job, that is their version of social mobility, that maybe Oxbridge is too much, but becoming a manager at Sainsbury's is not, right?
And different people want to do different things. And of course, we've got children at school who are going to Oxbridge and it's really exciting and we're 100% behind that. So you don't want to stop doing that, but not everyone can go to Oxbridge, that's all.
But one thing I did want to ask you, though, because I think you went to Oxford, didn't you?
Yeah.
Because when it comes to Oxbridge, the Higher Education Minister said recently that those universities shouldn't discriminate against private school students going to Oxbridge, that there's always, it's tilted too much and they're too focused on getting more state school kids in. What's your view of that?
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest. I don't know how much they're tilting one way or the other. It is important that the places that everyone wants to get into, whether it's the big law firms or it's Oxbridge and so on, it's important that they recognise that they can get talent from all different types of places. And they're not just coming from the private sector or they're just not coming from the state sector. So they need to keep an open mind, and that's good. But from my point of view, I'm thinking about how can we make sure, as the Commission, how can we make sure as many people as possible are enabled to be able to make a success of their lives, finding a career that they love, which will give them purpose and satisfaction. Because not all of us want to be Prime Minister, not all of us want to be millionaires. And that's good. I mean, you're not Prime Minister and you're very happy doing your job, you know? like, that's the thing. All of us want to do different things. I love being a teacher. I love being at school with the children. So we all need to do what makes us passionate, you know?
What would you like to do in the future? I mean, you're extremely successful professional in teaching. You've now got a public sector role advising the government on social mobility. Is politics something you might want to do one day?
No, never. I mean, in fact, I feel bad us chatting about Boris because at the end of the day, he's just a man and he's taken on a role that I would never do. And I would never do it because I wouldn't want people sitting on a television programme chatting about me in this way. And yet, in that sense, he has sacrificed, you know, and given over his life to do that.
But if you did do it, you could implement your school model across the entire country.
No, that's the thing. You need to win people's hearts and minds. You can't do that. In fact, in many ways, you're very powerless as Prime Minister. I think we misunderstand just how much power a Prime Minister actually has.
Katharine, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
And if you scan this QR code on your screen right now, you can watch all of our interviews online and all of the previous episodes of the show if you'd like to. Well, stay with us because coming up next, I'll be talking to Dame Emma Thompson and her co-star Daryl McCormack.
I'm Stuart Ramsey and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
Well, there's a real sense now that people are beginning to expect that this whole airlift is coming to an end and they're really, really desperate. We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people and putting them into trucks.
You either live and recover or you die.
Okay, so that's like a war.
That's the war, yes.
We help you understand the world with us.
Over the past 24 hours, the soldiers have been attacked on a number of occasions. It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change. We've been crushed.
We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world. They were convinced the United States would become hooked. Well, they were right.
An enormous explosion has just come down. I think it was a monster just landed in between us.
The information on this could bring down the entire network, not just in Iraq and Syria, but across the world.
It's out of control, but the pig we're drawn. It's so hot.
Con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena, o sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
We support communities to grow food in lost and unloved spaces across the city. So our main kind of driving force is to get people growing.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
Welcome back. One of Britain's leading ladies for 4 decades, actor, comedian, writer, and at times a political campaigner, Emma Thompson has always been unafraid of facing taboos, and now she deals with a big one in her new film, Good Luck to You, Leo Grande. But I was also keen to ask her about the government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, not least because she has an adopted son who was a refugee from that country. I met her and Darryl McCormack earlier. Can we start off with the film, because it's a film about the sexuality of middle-aged women in many ways, and about compassion too. And you've been in the business for a long, long time. Do you think a script like this would have been even written 5 or 10 years ago?
Maybe 5 years ago, but 10 years ago, probably not. Actually, I think it's a very good question, because even though things have been changing and there are more interesting things for women, don't forget, 5 years ago, Mindy Kaling wrote Late Night, which is about a female talk show host, which has never been seen on screen before, never been thought about, which is actually, when you think about it, completely mad. Completely mad.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Why isn't there a female talk show host? That's what, because women can't talk? No, does not compute, everybody. It's just crazy. Anyway, and they have interesting personalities and are fun. But what's sort of original about it is the encounter itself, and the fact that it's about so many things. It is about female sexuality, of course, but it's about sexual pleasure and shame across the board, and about, the possible kind of sanctity of sex work as well.
For 31 years, my husband would climb on top, do the business, roll off, put his pyjamas on and go back to sleep. I've never had an orgasm. And yes, in fact, if we do this, he will only be the second man I have ever had sex with. Oh, God.
Nancy?
This is crazy.
Nancy?
It's terrible. It's wrong.
Nancy?
Yes?
Let's go to bed.
OK.
It really does cover so much.
It does.
But you're right about the middle-aged thing,
I really enjoyed it because I thought it spoke to an audience that sometimes isn't spoken to or of. And it seemed to me as well it was sort of correct and in balance, in that the cinema's often besotted with sort of young women and treating them as sexual beings, and a man's sexy at any age. And then women, as they get older, they sort of disappear, like sexually they disappear.
Well, it would be a pretty big thing to try and counteract with one acting role in a film. So, yeah, I try not to think about the sort of global implications of my work while I'm acting something. I'm just trying to make it as truthful as possible. Whether it does have that effect, it would be lovely. But I don't think about it in those universal terms. It's interesting to talk about it afterwards. But what I was drawn to was this woman who'd really ticked all the boxes. I think this is the interesting thing, that there are lots of shapes that we're invited to get into. And I think, Daz will say, men as well, this is what you should be. Women in particular, because they don't have as much freedom, like it or not. Everyone says, oh no, we've done all that. No, we haven't. So accept that, because we haven't done it yet. Women are not as free as men to do what they want. They're simply not. And so Nancy's admissions about the limitations of her life and the limitations of what she's experienced are very painful.
Did you feel sorry for Nancy? I mean, when you meet your 4th meeting, she says, you're the only adventure I've ever had, the only freedom. And then in the first meeting, she tells you, I've never had an orgasm. I've never had oral sex. Did you both, when you read the script, did you think, poor Nancy?
Did you think poor Nancy ever?
I not particularly, because I think we come from a similar place where I thought it was incredible that she was making this choice for herself, that she was taking this autonomy to go and seek this experience, kind of at her age as well, and at the experience that she's been given prior to this moment. So I never felt poor Nancy, I thought, wow, the kind of scope of the experience that she's going through and the vulnerability that she's walking through to get there, I thought was quite incredible to see. So, you know, I think I never tried to have an emotional take on where they were coming from. I just was fascinated by the difference in their walks of life and what they were both going through.
I do feel the tragedy of her, you know, at 16, sort of nearly having access to her sexuality and then it being somehow taken away, and then she goes and does her A-levels and goes to teacher training and becomes a teacher and gets married and does all the things right and does everything right, and never ever returns or never continues that journey, because, as she says, you know, she was pretty much living in the 50s. But to be honest with you, Beth, I don't think that female pleasure is at the top of anybody's to-do kind of list.
I've never done anything interesting or remarkable in my life. This is it. I see my friends shriveling up over the years. Sorry.
Nancy, everyone needs something different. I don't judge my clients unless they're total arseholes.
It also seemed to me that for Nancy, she grew up in a world, as you said, where female pleasure was not something discussed. In fact, if anything, female sexuality was almost a taboo. Do you think there'd be an intergenerational difference where younger women might watch this film and go, oh my God, my poor mother, aunt, grandma, is that what they had to put up with? And they won't relate to it because they're like, that's not how we live now. We're empowered sexually.
Oh, but I talked to lots of young women about this, and quite a few of them have said to me, I didn't even know about masturbation until I was in my 20s. You know, we think that this revolution has occurred.
What younger women say?
Because young women, 22, 23 years old.
That surprises me, actually.
Well, here we are. We're here to be surprised, aren't we? Because we live in London and we've lived in, you know, this sort of rather metropolitan, cosmopolitan world where people have access to all sorts of things and read Cosmopolitan, which sort of suggests that if you haven't had an orgasm in the last 15 minutes, you're not truly alive, you know, which is a form of, I think, a kind of bullying. You know what I mean? If you're not emerging, going, oh fantastic. Yeah,
you're not living your best life.
Or just sort of, yes, just having spontaneous orgasms at Westminster, you know, because that's like, you're just in it and there, you know, as if it's an easy thing to achieve. But I think I think we're very dishonest about sex, and I think we're often very dishonest about how much we're actually enjoying it, to be honest.
Well, actually, that's one thing I really liked the film was about it kind of picked up on the sort of awkwardness and weirdness of sex sometimes as well, didn't it? Between the two characters. I just want to ask more about it. There's a bit of a dark moment, I thought, in the film when Nancy gets quite upset with Leo because he's sort of saying, well, you might want more sessions, and it's really because he's saying, you actually just need to talk to me. And then she says, I'm paying you for a service I don't have mine, just get on with it. And it kind of, it makes it really transactional because you forget that this is a transaction. There's a danger in the film, could you imagine, if you did the exact same film, but the genders of the protagonists were reversed, it becomes more sinister. So it becomes a sort of...
You couldn't make this film and reverse the genders.
You couldn't.
You simply couldn't make it. Because the playing field is not level. It just wouldn't make any sense. There's nothing to explore there, or there's other things to explore, but they would be very, very different.
I just want to ask you one other thing on that. Ageism, it's still a prejudice that sort of seems permissible in society, and for older women they often suffer a sort of double prejudice because you're too old for roles, you're too old to have sex, you're too old to even be seen anymore. Is that something you feel strongly about, or as you get older, do you feel it's changing?
Well, I've been very lucky because young women like Katie and Mindy have written things for me that are completely haven't been seen before, which says two things. First of all, I don't feel invisible. And second of all, there's change. Because young women don't just want to write films about young women, they want to write films about all female experience. And also because Katie was interested in writing something about a young man and young men's experience, which is, I think, quite hard.
Yeah, I think it's interesting about I think Katie did a really good job, you know. There's something interesting about Leo in the context that he is in a professional environment, so we don't really get to see much of his inner life. But I think I'm really grateful Katie did note that he is also going through his own journey with regards to sexuality, with regards to kind of body image at some point as well. But I think that's the reason why he's able to be here and lay this foundation, because I think he's gone through his own experience. So I hope, even though it's not as fleshed out, I think there is an element there where, you know, that young men will also go through their own version. I think that's what is universal about this, is that we do have to look at that journey for ourselves.
Daryl, when you were born, Emma was already a major thing, right? She's a major star. Was it weird to be cast in a romantic relationship?
I was already, when you were born, as you were coming out, I was receiving my first.
Do you know what's funny, actually? Yeah. So what, the Oscars are usually in January, right?
Yes, that's right.
So I was born in January '93. That was the year you won your Oscar.
That's right.
And then you're in a romantic relationship. How was that?
Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? I think that's amazing, that this job that we do, that you can really just be completely different, you can really share environments like this.
It's so fantastic,
I think that's amazing,
isn't it? Actually, I hadn't thought about it like that.
Yeah.
So
isn't it insane?
Generationally, you asked Beth earlier, which is very interesting. I think that it's absolutely true that my mother's generation had a completely different entry into sort of sexual life to my generation, and you're younger than me, but you know, 60s, 70s, I was born in 59, and then my daughter's generation. Those three generations of women, it'd be very interesting to do something about the three.
But it's got better for your daughter.
I hope so. I mean, I think some things are worse. When I hear stories in schools about boys and what they expect from girls.
What do you mean?
Oh, well, I mean that the easy access to porn, you know, if you talk to young people about their sexual knowledge and what they expect and what they think sex is, it can be very disturbing indeed. And I think can interfere with their sexual development, because it's all been taken away, industrialised and fed back to them in a sort of completely kind of unindigestible form. You know, so I think that there are pressures outside. I also think that the sexual revolution is a very complex issue. It's not like we had that and then everything was better, and now young people, it's all better. It's never like that in human experience. We take a step forward and then we tie ourselves into weird knots, because the fact of the matter is we have no respect at all for our sexual desires. We ridicule them, we make them the butt of our jokes, we don't respect what our desires are, and we find, when they're odd, which they often are, we find them shameful and ridiculous.
I just wanted to ask you, finally, there's a major refugee crisis in Europe. You've spoken about refugee causes. Your own adopted son, I think, was a refugee. Do you think we're doing enough at the moment for refugees and for Ukraine?
No, but I mean, you know, refugees across the board. The real problem is our sort of referral mechanisms are a mess, and the Rwanda scheme is sort of eye-wateringly mad and callous. You know, we're exhibiting a callousness in government that I don't think reflects the soul of this country and the nature of the people in this country. I really don't. I understand that you know, a lot of refugees will be thinking, well, it's all, you know, all the Ukrainians are white, and this kind of welcome wasn't given to Syrian refugees when the same sort of thing was happening in Aleppo and all that. And I understand that too, but at the same time, there's been a huge compassionate opening of British people, but people in this country have all wanted to help so much, and been really severely prevented from doing so by government mechanisms and all sorts of internal difficulties with things like bank accounts and not our civil society not somehow being helped to rise to the occasion. I mean, this is a very, very complex issue, but the movement of peoples, not only due to war but due to climate change, is going to be one of the biggest issues of our time and certainly of the 21st century. And we better start getting our minds around how people need to move. And we will have to accept that. We can't become fortresses, we can't put up walls anymore. It's not realistic.
We've run out of time, but maybe one day we could do another interview together, you never know.
We'll do a more political one.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you so much. Thanks for spending some time talking to me, and congratulations on the film, which I'm going to force everyone I know to watch.
That's brilliant. I like the word force.
Yeah, force.
I think that's good.
I think that's good. I mean, I'm now an empowered middle-aged woman and I'm going to force everyone. Emma Thompson, they're breaking so many taboos. Well, stay with us, because coming up next, I'll be joined by the author of The Premonition and The Fifth Risk, Michael Lewis.
We support communities to grow food in lost and unloved spaces across the city. So our main kind of driving force is to get people growing.
Welcome back. What can we learn from the last 2 years living in a global pandemic? Michael Lewis is a best-selling author of The Fifth Risk, The Big Short and Moneyball. His latest book, The Premonition, looks at the official response to the COVID outbreak by the US administration. I spoke to him earlier. Michael, thanks so much for coming on the show. I've read lots of your books and it's really, really great to meet you.
Total pleasure.
So thanks for coming on. And I want to start with The Fifth Risk, which as a political journalist, I have to say I found absolutely fascinating. It's this story of the transition from Obama to Trump and basically what a mess it was. Trump resistant to even having a transition team, hundreds of posts left empty. But before we get into the book and what it's about, and also it being making into a TV series, can you explain to the viewers what does the fifth risk actually mean?
Well, the title comes from a conversation I had with someone who was managing existential risks in part of the US government. And I was just asking him, like, what are the top 5 risks that you worry about in your little department, the Department of Energy? So I'm worried about nuclear weapons going off when they shouldn't go off. And we spend a lot of time thinking about that. Or not going off if we need them to go off. You know, I'm worried about the Iran nuclear deal because we're in the middle of that. So he's listing them and he gets to 5. Yeah. And when he gets to the 5th one, it's such a boring sounding one, but it ended up being right at the center of the story I was telling it. And he says the 5th risk, I'm going to call it program management. And with it, what I mean by that is there are these risks that the United States government are managing that they go through for generations. They're long-term risks. And that if we take our eye off the ball, catastrophic things can happen. And there are these things throughout the federal government. So when I called the 5th risk, I was thinking like, these are the risks you as a citizen are oblivious to. You're just taking it for granted that your government is handling it in some way more or less competently. At the same time, you yourself probably think very little of your government because you're an American and Americans have been trained to hate their government. What happens if this goes wrong? So the book, that was kind of a starting point for them.
There is the 5th risk. There are all these risks within government, and then President Trump is elected.
And it tells you a lot about the state of our society, right? So by law, the outgoing administration, in that case the Obama administration, is required to prepare briefings for the incoming administration because our government, unlike yours, is managed by presidential appointees, not career civil servants. So 4,000 plus people are going to roll in with the new president, and they're going to have to be appointed by him and confirmed by the Senate to run all these different agencies.
OK, let me ask you another question, because viewers here might think, in the UK, might think Trump's, it's done, it's over, there's a Biden, it's a new era. But how worried are you about Trump coming back and becoming the president again in 2024?
I wouldn't like it.
Are you worried about it? Do you think it's a possibility?
Of course it's a possibility. And of course it's unpredictable. If you ask me to put odds on it, I'd say 5 to 1 against. I don't think it's the likely outcome.
Why? Because you think the Republicans will alight on a different candidate? Yes,
I do. And I think he's not good at being president. I mean, he didn't. If he had run a half-decent pandemic response, he'd still be president. That his incompetence ends up being a big issue. And
we're going to come on to the pandemic, but before I do, just quickly, because the thing also about the 5th risk, I mean, everyone should read it. I actually listened to it on I listened to the audiobook. But also it's been made into a Netflix drama, right?
Just came out, yeah.
By the Obama production company.
Yes.
So how did that come about? Had they got? Why did the Obamas want to televise a book about that's so critical of Trump? Is there an agenda there?
I tell you what's funny about it. You would think it sounds the way you just put that. Obama saw an anti-Trump thing and thought, "Oh, we'll put that on television."
That is what I thought.
It's the opposite. That they've been bending over backwards, the Obamas, to avoid engaging in any kind of overt political kind of messaging activity. What attracted Obama, so it counted against the book that it had this kind of anti-Trump undertone. What appealed to him about it was the first attempt to really describe what the hell the government did. You know, like these management of existential risks that nobody knew about. He really liked the idea of basically delivering an entertaining civics lesson.
I thought maybe part of the Obama's motivation for televising this was to actually kind of send a warning to America as they saw it of don't make the same mistake twice, guys, if this man runs in 2024. But that wasn't...
It was a different warning. It was to deliver. It was, okay. And the warning was, you neglect this government that you have at your peril.
What's he like? What's it like doing a project with him?
Well, I met him because I wrote about him. I wrote a big piece for Vanity Fair years ago, and I kind of moved into his life in the White House when he was president and got to know him a bit then. In some ways, a very unlikely politician, in that you don't feel like you're with a politician. You feel like, you know what he's got the temperament, the personality of a writer. Fun to be with. I was very fond of him. I mean, interesting guy. I think I told him once, it may have offended him, that if he was not black, I don't think he'd have been president, because the fact that he was black disguised just how unpolitical he was, unlike a politician he was, that how peculiar he was. And the truth is that this man would never have been a politician if he'd had a successful literary career. He started out wanting to write short stories, and they didn't get accepted. And I think he's like a writer who stumbled into politics and found a calling. But you do mistake him if you think like the reason he grabbed my book was it was a way to needle Donald Trump. It was the opposite. He told the producers that leave Trump to one side. This isn't about Trump. They didn't listen to him completely.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
but how could you?
One thing that really astonished me in the book is the moment where you say Trump finds out he's won, Pennsylvania's called, and then Karen Pence goes to hug Mike Pence, the vice president. Or, sorry, Mike goes to hug Karen. Yeah. And sort of for a congratulatory hug, and she kind of pushes him away and says something like, you got you got what you want.
She was offended by him. I mean,
offended by who? Mike Pence or Donald Trump, or both of them?
Donald Trump and Mike Pence's allegiance to him at that moment. You got what you wanted, Mike, leave me alone. I mean, you got to remember, this is, she's a good Christian lady from middle America, and Donald Trump is violating everything she believes in left and right. And I think she was offended by him. I've never heard her say that, but that was, I interviewed people who watched that encounter. And so who knows exactly what was going on in her head. Let's
go on to about the pandemic, the pandemic book, the Premonition. You talk about that, about what happened in the US. It was a UK, for us, it was a traumatic experience too. 180,000 deaths here. In the US, with a much bigger population, of course, 1 million deaths. In your book, you say America or the West developed the tools to defeat a pandemic, but America didn't implement those tools. What do you mean by that? Was that a Trump problem or a US government problem?
It's the most remarkable story. We both share, and we kind of both share this story. There was a study in 2019 done at great expense, millions of dollars, hundreds of experts, to determine, this is before the pandemic, which countries on the planet were best equipped to deal with a pandemic. Like who had the resources, who was going to respond best. The United States came out #1 and the UK came out #2. So we, in theory, are best prepared for this. In practice, our death rates were off the charts. I mean, we're kind of like, I don't know where the US is now, but we were 120th, somewhere down there. You know, Yemen outperforms this kind of thing. And so that was the beginning, what interested me, is like, what happened?
Have you come up with the conclusion that we would be better or worse equipped to cope with another pandemic as the result of the COVID experience?
We as a world, or we as the United States?
Well, let's do both.
So we as the United States are clearly worse off.
Why?
Because there's not only no agreement on what we did right and what we did wrong, there's active disagreement. And 40% of the country won't get vaccinated. 40% of the country thinks that the social interventions were pointless.
But sorry,
so it'd be harder to lead the country.
But Michael, is that not just partly also not about the sort of, about the who was in power? I mean, you know, some of the disinformation. I remember watching that press conference agog, as Donald Trump said, you know, what we could do, I remember it, you know, we could inject disinfectant as a coronavirus. Do you remember it? I remember it. I was watching it. And then Dr. Britch is sort of standing, the camera pans to the to the health official, and she's just staring. I mean,
no, I know.
But the point being that there's a serious. I mean, the thing was ludicrous, but there was a very serious point in that, which is if a leader shares disinformation, then the anti-vaxxers and people stop believing in the process. I mean, presumably under a different leadership, it might be better for the US if there was a pandemic.
That would be true, would have been true, had there been different leadership the first time we went through this, and people could have been led. And so instead of 40% of the population revolting against the right thing to do, it would have been 20%. But now they've revolted and dug in their heels. They'll be much harder to persuade. I mean, there will be if there were, right now, if a more lethal pathogen swept across the United States, there would be an instinctive and well-organized resistance to doing anything to defend ourselves.
Michael, just before we end, I hope you don't mind me asking you about this. As you were writing the book on COVID, what was going on, your own family experienced an unbearable tragedy, and your daughter, I hope you don't mind me asking you about her. Your daughter, Dixie, died in a car crash.
Right as the book was coming out. And it's been the hardest year of my life. She was 19. She was with her boyfriend, Ross, who was a year older, Ross Schultz, and they drove in broad daylight head-on into a truck. And it makes one aware of a few things very quickly. One, how precious life is, and two, how it can change in a heartbeat. And three, the amazing thing to me right away was I've never had this kind of grief. I've never experienced this kind of loss. My parents are still alive and flourishing. And instantly, I was admitted as a kind of citizen to the kingdom of grief and made aware of how much of this there was around me to which I had been oblivious. Close friends. And especially now, how much loss people have endured in the past couple of years. And there's a psychology to loss. But it's an inarticulate psychology. People behave differently when they've experienced the loss, and it expresses itself in strange ways. I'm just trying, personally, to navigate it in my own way so I minimize the damage it causes. I loved her so much. I was so proud to be her dad. She was just the best human being, and she was going to change the world. I can't do anything about the fact she's gone. All I can do is make sure that what happens next isn't worse or bad. I can just try to respond in positive ways to it. I think that I cannot speak for other people in their grief, but in my case, the experience of loss is a loss of love. And leaning into love in various ways in response to her death has been enormously healing. Leaning into other people's need for love. So it's the tempting mistake that I think we've been avoiding is denial.
Just on the writing, you've written about finance, you've written about policy, you've written about so many things. Do you think now you might write about grief, that might help other people grieving?
Yes. I'm not quite sure what form the writing is going to take. I know it won't take the form of a how-to, because I think it's so peculiar. The experience of grief is sui generis, that grief is grief, but it's not. Each person's grief is different. It depends on the nature of the loss, the nature of the relationship you had with the person who's lost, who you are, how your chemicals work. So I would be very hard, I'd be very wary about telling people how to go through this experience, except to say, however you're going through it is fine. Walk in and embrace what's peculiar about your own response, because there's some truth in that. Now, how I write about it, I've got some ideas about how I might write about it, but I'm not going to ever be in a position of preaching to people or how they should experience their own loss. It wouldn't be my style.
Well, thank you for talking to me about it, because I'm sure that many people watching it find it very comforting, because I don't think any of us talk about grief
We don't do loss
enough.
well.
We don't do loss well, and And a lot of people live through it and find it hard.
Yeah.
So thank you. And
Sure.
I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you to all of our guests, Michael Lewis, Dame Emma Thompson and Daryl McCormack, and Katharine Birbalsingh. And thank you for watching. And if you scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can listen to the Beth Rigby Interviews podcast. A new episode's available now. Each week, I take a look at the highlights of the interviews, and there's some extra bits and pieces in there too. That's on the Sky News app or wherever you get your podcasts.
The world seems to be becoming more and more divided. Issues around politics, culture, the pandemic are resulting in vastly opposing viewpoints, causing real rifts between us. I want to get in the middle of those debates. I want to better understand where each stance comes from and whether there's room for compromise. Join me, Trevor Phillips, as we look to find common ground on Sky News.
The plan is to take the political temperature midweek. So we'll be discussing the biggest stories of the week so far, talking about what's still to come, having a look at Prime Minister's questions, of course, and getting a reaction from politicians, plus our very own viewers. And we'll have analysis from my Sky News colleagues.
The Take with Sophie Rich on Sky News.
Con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena, o sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
I'm Yvan Bourgnon, I'm a sailor. I spent half time of my life on the sea. We have a factory who can convert this plastic to energy. And so after, at the end, we can minimize the footprint carbon of the boat.